By the summer of 1943, the war in North Africa had turned decisively against Germany. Tens of thousands of captured Wehrmacht soldiers, men from the Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe ground units, and support divisions, found themselves herded into ships under the watchful eyes of Allied guards. They were told little about their destination. Some believed they would be sent to Britain. Others thought they were being taken to secret prison islands. Only when the ships sailed west across the Atlantic did the truth begin to form. They were bound for America. For many of them, the word Vorch Amerikov carried mythical weight, what a place described in propaganda as decadent, chaotic, and dangerous. It was the land of their enemy, the distant power that bombed their cities and supplied the Allies with endless resources. To be sent there as a prisoner of war seemed both terrifying and surreal. The journey across the ocean lasted weeks. The holds were crowded and dark, filled with the sound of engines and the murmurs of men who could no longer pretend to be soldiers. They were fed adequately, more than they had expected, and treated without cruelty. Still, most of them suspected a trick. They whispered that the kindness was temporary, that once the ships reached the American shore, the real punishment would begin. When they finally arrived, it was not to the grim labor camps they had imagined. The ports of New York, Norfolk, and Boston received them with military efficiency but not hostility. American guards searched them, recorded their names, and loaded them onto trains. As the convoys moved inland, the prisoners stared through the windows in silence. What they saw surprised them. Green fields, small towns, children waving from roadsides, people going about their lives as if the war were happening on another planet. The trains carried them deep into the American heartland, to Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Wisconsin, and dozens of other states where hundreds of camps had been hastily built to house them. Some camps stood near farmlands, others beside forests or army bases. The wire fences were high, but the land beyond them looked open and peaceful. The first days were filled with disbelief. The prisoners expected harsh treatment, interrogation, even starvation. Instead, they were given clean uniforms, showers, and medical checkups. The guards were firm, but not cruel. When the first meal was served, meat, vegetables, and fresh bread, many of the Germans refused to eat at first, convinced it was a test. As the days turned into weeks, their confusion deepened. The Americans spoke to them without hatred, sometimes even with curiosity. The camp commanders explained the rules. They would not be mistreated as long as they followed orders. They would be assigned work, paid in canteen coupons, and given access to books, music, and sports. It all sounded absurd, like propaganda in reverse. At night, the men whispered in disbelief. Could this really be how the enemy treated captives? Was it mercy or psychological warfare? Some insisted it was a trick, that one day the gates would close for good and the real suffering would begin. Others simply didn't know what to believe. But as summer turned to autumn and no punishments came, suspicion slowly gave way to something new was at I mine, curiosity. They watched American life unfold just beyond the fences. Soldiers joking, farmers working, children playing in the distance. For the first time, they saw the enemy not as faceless propaganda, but as people living ordinary lives in an extraordinary time. When the first work details were announced, picking fruit, harvesting wheat, repairing roads, the prisoners felt another wave of disbelief. They were being paid for their labor. And on Sundays, when work was done, the guards brought out soccer balls. No one quite understood what was happening, but one thought echoed through the camp. If this was captivity, it was unlike any they had imagined. The camp settled into rhythm faster than anyone expected. Each morning began with roll call under the pale light of dawn. The guards moved quietly, counting the rows of men standing in neat formation. The prisoners, still bound by the discipline of years in uniform, obeyed without protest. Afterward, they were served breakfast, with oatmeal, coffee, sometimes eggs, with a meal richer than what most German civilians could dream of at that point in the war. Work assignments followed. Groups of 20 or 30 men were loaded onto trucks and driven out beyond the camp fences. Some went to nearby farms to pick cotton, harvest potatoes, or repair fences damaged by storms. Others worked in sawmills, cutting lumber for military construction. The Geneva Convention allowed it, and the American government saw value in turning idle manpower into productivity. At first, the Germans approached the work with suspicion. They waited for the insult, the punishment, the humiliation they believed would follow. But none came. Farmers treated them not as enemies, but as laborers. They were offered water, sometimes sandwiches, and, on rare occasions, a few kind words. When payment came, small paper coupons redeemable at the camp canteen, it seemed like a joke. Many refused it at first, convinced there must be a hidden rule they did not understand. Inside the camp, life grew unexpectedly structured. The prisoners created small communities. Bakers made bread. Teachers started language classes, and musicians played in makeshift bands. They built chess sets out of wood and carved miniature figures from soap. The Americans, watching from outside the wire, seemed both amused and impressed by the efficiency with which the former soldiers organized their confinement. Some guards began to treat the prisoners as workers rather than captives. They laughed with them, shared cigarettes, even practiced a few words of German. Why, job one, might say, patting a man on the shoulder after a day's labor. It was a gesture that carried no political meaning, only human recognition. For men who had spent years in a system that measured worth only in obedience, it was disarming. The canteen became the center of camp life. There, the men spent their coupons on small luxuries, soap, razors, candy bars, sometimes even Coca-Cola. The first time a German prisoner tasted it, he grimaced and called it too sweet, vumpt, but many quickly developed a fondness for the strange, fizzy drink. Chocolate and canned fruit were the other treasures, symbols of abundance they had never known at home. Sundays were different. There was no work. Instead, the fences opened onto a field, and the prisoners were allowed to play soccer. The Americans watched from the sidelines, cheering or laughing when a goal was scored. For a few hours, the war disappeared. The shouts, the running, the rhythm of the game all of it belonged to another world, one where uniforms did not define enemies. Some prisoners began to write home, their letters carefully censored but full of astonishment. They told their families that America was not what they had been taught. The food was good, the guards were fair. They were paid for their work. Few of their relatives would believe it when the letters arrived months later. The most striking change was not physical but psychological. The men who had once marched through conquered cities now found themselves building barns and stacking hay for farmers who treated them with politeness. The humiliation they had feared never came. Instead, they felt something more confusing: respect. In the evenings, the camp grew quiet. The sound of harmonicas drifted through the air, mingling with the faint echo of American radio from the guard towers. The men lay on their bunks, thinking about what they had seen. The fences were still there. The war still raged an ocean away, but something inside had shifted. For the first time, they wondered if everything they had been told about the enemy had been a lie. By the spring of 1944, the camps had become small, self-contained societies. Within the wire, life no longer revolved around survival, but around adaptation. The prisoners began to shape their confinement into something resembling normal life, a paradoxical peace inside a war. The American officers encouraged the development of order and structure. They saw education as a way to occupy the minds of thousands of idle men. Soon, lectures appeared in the camp schedules of IMS, English lessons, history discussions, even mathematics classes taught by former teachers and engineers among the prisoners. The Americans provided chalk, boards, and paper. The rest was built from memory. It was an unexpected gift, one that confused many of the soldiers. They had been taught to expect punishment. Yet here they were, studying the language of their enemy and learning about democracy, literature, and philosophy. Some attended out of curiosity, others from boredom, but a few began to see in it something deeper, a chance to rediscover themselves outside of ideology. The camp libraries grew as Red Cross shipments arrived. Books in both English and German filled the shelves. Goethe and Shakespeare, military manuals, and American novels. Some prisoners devoured them hungrily. For the first time, they read ideas unfiltered by propaganda, won concepts of freedom, equality, and individuality that had once been labeled as threats. Music became another form of quiet rebellion against despair. Many of the prisoners had brought harmonicas or makeshift instruments, and with time, full orchestras formed. They played Beethoven and Mozart, sometimes jazz, which fascinated the younger men. The guards listened from the perimeters, tapping their feet to rhythms once banned in Germany. One of the strangest moments came when the camp orchestra performed for the Americans. The concert was held outdoors, under a flag that once symbolized their enemy. The sound of violins and brass drifted across the fields, mixing with the wind. For a few hours, both sides stood still, where soldiers and captors, bound not by orders, but by music. Work outside the camp continued. The prisoners' reputation spread among local farmers and business owners. They were known as disciplined, efficient, and reliable. Some Americans who had lost sons in Europe refused to employ them, but others saw only men who wanted to work. Gradually, hostility gave way to pragmatism, then to respect. A few German officers still held on to their pride. They called the others weak, accused them of forgetting their duty. But even they could not ignore the quiet transformation taking place. The men laughed more easily, shared cigarettes with guards, and even played chess with them through the fence. On Sundays, soccer remained the great equalizer. Teams were organized into leagues, and the Americans often joined in. When a German striker scored a goal against an American team, cheers erupted from both sides. It was strange, impossible even, yet real. A moment when war's divisions dissolved into the universal language of sport. Letters home continued to trickle through. The men wrote about the fields, the food, the fairness of their guards. They avoided politics but described life in simple terms: work, books, games, and unexpected kindness. The letters often ended the same way. One weinen. Do not worry. I am treated well. One. For many, that truth carried more weight than they could express. The men who had been told that Americans were brutal found themselves living among them, working beside them, even laughing with them. The contradictions were too great to ignore. As summer approached, a quiet realization spread through the camps. The war was still raging overseas, but inside the fences, something had changed forever. The prisoners had begun to see not just their captors differently, but themselves. They were no longer soldiers of a collapsing empire. They were menvum, simply menvum, learning to live again. As months passed, the atmosphere in the camps grew more complex. The routines of work, study, and sport had replaced the chaos of war. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension remained. For some prisoners, captivity had become a strange kind of peace. Yet that peace, brought with it guilt. Rumors from Europe filtered in through newspapers and Red Cross bulletins. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. Cities lay in ruins. Families were displaced. For many prisoners, reading those reports was more painful than any physical hardship. They were safe, fed, and paid for their labor, while their homeland was burning. A few of the older officers tried to preserve a sense of loyalty to the Reich. They spoke of duty and honor, of a Germany that would rise again. They gathered small groups around them in the evenings, reminding the men that they were still soldiers, not laborers or students. Some listened out of habit, but most turned away. The authority those officers once carried had begun to fade, replaced by quiet doubt. For the younger prisoners, the contradiction was sharper. They had grown up on slogans about sacrifice and superiority. Yet here, behind the wire, they worked beside Americans who treated them with fairness and respect. The enemy they had been taught to hate now offered them freedom of thought, books, even friendship. It was impossible to reconcile. That confusion created a new kind of division, not between guards and captives, but among the prisoners themselves. Some clung fiercely to their identity as soldiers, refusing to participate in English classes or sports. Others, drawn to the unfamiliar comfort of civility, began to adopt bits of American culture. They hummed swing tunes, practiced English phrases, or sketched scenes of farms and small towns beyond the fence. The camp commanders noticed the change. They called it moral disarmament. Moral disarmament. It was not forced nor political. It happened quietly, through kindness repeated, until it became habit. On Sundays, when soccer matches filled the field, even the most defiant officers watched from the sidelines. They did not cheer, but they did not stop the games either. The sound of laughter, once forbidden, had become part of life. Captivity was reshaping the men more deeply than any ideology had. They were beginning to understand that freedom was not a flag or a slogan. It was the ability to think, to choose, to see the world without fear. And though the fences still stood tall, many realized that inside them, they had begun to change forever. The news came quietly, almost without ceremony. It was May 1945, and the morning began like any other Ford. Roll call, breakfast, and the slow dispersal of work details. Then, an American officer arrived at the command hut with a folded piece of paper and a weary expression. A few moments later, a message was read aloud through the camp loudspeakers. Germany had surrendered. For a brief moment, the camp stood still. The guards looked uncertain, unsure whether to expect cheers or unrest. But the prisoners did neither. They simply stood in silence. Some lowered their heads. Others stared at the sky. The words, "unconditional surrender," hung in the air, like the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. For years, these men had marched under the belief that their homeland was invincible, that its destiny was written in conquest. Now they were told it was finished, not just defeated, but erased, occupied, divided. The banners, the oaths, the endless speeches, that all of it dissolved in a few lines of broadcast text. Some wept quietly. Others refused to believe it. "It cannot be," which one muttered, though no one answered. They had no weapons, no command, no purpose left. Only the fences and the strange peace of captivity remained. That evening, no one played music. The soccer field was empty. The canteen closed early. Even the Americans seemed subdued. Some guards, veterans of the European front, looked at the Germans with a strange sympathy. They had both fought in the same war, only on opposite sides. and now both were trying to understand what peace meant. In the days that followed, more details arrived. Photographs and newspapers confirmed what the prisoners feared. Their cities were gone. Berlin was rubble. Hamburg and Dresden were ruins. Families displaced. Millions dead. The news spread through the camp like a cold wind. Many prisoners asked to be left alone. They no longer talked of returning home, but of finding out whether home still existed. For the first time, they envied the guards, not for their freedom, but for their certainty. 1. The Americans knew where they belonged. The Germans no longer did. Yet amid the grief, something unexpected emerged. Some men began to talk openly about the future. If Germany is gone, which one said quietly, which? The Americans heard such remarks and encouraged them. They brought newspapers, maps, and sometimes lectures about rebuilding Europe, democracy, and reconciliation. It was not propaganda. It was a kind of education, one born of necessity. The Americans knew that these prisoners would one day return home and shape what came next. So they treated them not as enemies, but as men who would soon inherit a broken world. The camp changed tone once again. The bitterness softened into reflection. The prisoners still mourned, but they also began to plan, writing letters, learning trades, preparing for release. For years they had been trained to destroy. Now they began to imagine what it might mean to build. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the wire, the camp orchestra played again for the first time since the surrender. The melody was slow and uncertain, but it carried through the air like a whisper of something enduring. Guards and prisoners listened together in silence. No one applauded when it ended. They simply nodded to one another, acknowledging that history had closed one door and left another barely open. For the prisoners of war in America, the end of the war was not freedom. It was something harder, the beginning of understanding. By the summer of 1946, the camps that had once pulsed with life and noise began to empty. One by one, groups of prisoners were assembled at dawn, given papers stamped with Allied seals, and told to prepare for transport. The United States no longer needed them for labor, and the time had come to send them back across the ocean they had crossed in fear 3 years before. The news of repatriation brought mixed emotions. Some men cheered quietly, others looked uneasy. Home. The word itself had changed meaning. For many, there was no home left to return to. Letters from Germany spoke of ruins, hunger, and occupation zones. Families were scattered, entire neighborhoods erased. Even the idea of Germany had splintered into East and West, each shadowed by the new lines of another global divide. Still, the process moved with American precision. Prisoners were issued new clothes, medical checkups, and small pay certificates for their labor. They were given final meals that many would remember for the rest of their lives. Warm bread, butter, fruit, and coffee var, symbols of abundance that no longer existed in their homeland. Before departure, the Americans allowed the prisoners one final soccer match. It was a farewell tradition, played between the guards and the Germans who had once been their captives. The match drew nearly the entire camp to the sidelines. The sun was high, and laughter echoed over the fields. There were no ranks, no flags, only men chasing a ball across open ground. When the game ended in a draw, both sides shook hands and exchanged caps. It was a small gesture, but for many, it felt like forgiveness. The journey home reversed the path they had once taken. Once trains to the coast, ships across the Atlantic, then more trains through shattered Europe. But the men who returned were not the same as those who had left. Their bodies were leaner, their uniforms replaced by plain clothes, their minds heavy with reflection. As their ships neared Europe, a thick fog rolled in, blurring the horizon. The men stood on deck, watching the faint outline of a continent they had not seen in years. There was no celebration, only quiet. The air smelled of salt and rust wad, and of endings. When they disembarked, the reality of post-war Germany struck them harder than any prison fence ever had. The ports were ruins. The cities hollow shells of stone. Children begged for food in the streets, and women sorted rubble into neat piles for rebuilding. The prisoners realized that the America they had left behind Vard, with its clean barracks, full meals, and open fields Vard, had been, in many ways, a gentler captivity than the freedom they had returned to. Some men went in search of families and found none. Others wandered through towns they no longer recognized. Yet a few carried something with them that the devastation could not erase: the lessons learned behind the wire. They had seen a nation that treated its enemies with restraint, that valued fairness even in victory. They had learned that discipline could come without cruelty, and authority without fear. In the quiet spaces between labor and soccer, between reading and music, they had discovered an idea of humanity that no ideology had ever taught them. In the years that followed, many of those former prisoners would help rebuild their country. They became farmers, teachers, engineers, craftsmen, men who understood the fragility of order and the cost of hatred. Some wrote memoirs, describing how they had first believed the Americans was a trick, only to find that it was real. Decades later, a few returned to visit the places where they had once been held Vard, the camps that were now parks or farmland. They stood on the grass where the fences had stood and listened to the wind. The voices were gone, but the lessons remained. They had come to America as soldiers and left as men who finally understood peace. In the years that followed their return, the former prisoners of war scattered across a broken nation. Some returned to the same fields and towns where they had been born, while others wandered through the ruins in search of work and purpose. Germany, divided and disoriented, was no longer the country they had fought for. It was a land of rubble and silence, where survival had replaced ideology and rebuilding had become the only mission left. At first, their status as former soldiers carried suspicion. Civilians saw in them not heroes, but reminders of a past everyone wanted to forget. Yet the men who had been held in America were different. They did not speak of revenge or bitterness. They spoke of work, fairness, and the need for patience. Their time in captivity had not erased their identity, but it had changed how they saw it. They had experienced something unimaginable during the war, a form of captivity that had shown them decency, order, and respect from the very people they had been told were enemies. Now, in the shattered streets of Frankfurt, Munich, and Hamburg, they carried that memory like a quiet flame. Many of them became the backbone of Reconstruction. Former mechanics from Texas camps repaired engines for new factories. Farmers who had worked American soil introduced better crop rotations. Teachers who had learned English in captivity reopened schools and taught languages, history, and tolerance. They brought back ideas, not about politics, but about how a society could function without fear. One man, a former sergeant who had spent 3 years at a camp in Iowa, organized a youth football club for displaced children. He had played in those weekend matches behind the wire, and now he believed sport could rebuild something deeper than muscle: trust. Within a few years, the club had grown into a community, giving boys who had lost everything a sense of belonging. Others spoke quietly about what they had learned from their guardsvamd, not through words, but through example. They had seen Americans work beside one another without class or uniform, speak their minds freely, and disagree without punishment. Those lessons, carried home across the Atlantic, spread slowly through conversations, classrooms, and workplaces. As Germany rebuilt itself under Allied supervision, the former prisoners became silent ambassadors of a different understanding. They had seen a world where freedom was not chaos, where discipline was not cruelty, and where humanity survived even after war. For many of them, that vision shaped the country that would later become the Federal Republic of Germany. WWII, democratic, cautious, and determined never to repeat its past. Yet the memory of captivity remained bittersweet. When they gathered years later at reunions, they spoke not of hardship, but of strange moments of peace, the taste of Coca-Cola, the sound of jazz on American radios, the soccer matches that blurred the line between prisoner and guard. They laughed at how suspicious they had been at first, how they had thought the payments for labor were tricks, or that the kindness was part of some clever interrogation strategy. In time, they realized it had simply been humanity. Their children, born after the war, often grew up in a world their fathers had helped shape, one that valued cooperation over obedience. When those children asked about America, the men rarely spoke of the fighting. They spoke instead of work, books, and the realization that respect could be stronger than fear. Some historians would later call the American POW camps Viking schools of democracy, but for the men who lived through them, the experience was simpler and deeper. They had gone to America as enemies and returned home as men who had seen another way to live. The fences were gone, but the lessons endured carried quietly in the hands that rebuilt walls, planted crops, and taught children to think freely. For the rest of their lives, many of them would look back on those years with a strange gratitude, knowing that captivity had given them what war never could, a glimpse of peace that lasted long after the guns had fallen silent. Decades passed. The war that had once consumed the world became history, and the men who had lived through it became old. By the 1972nd, the former German prisoners of war who had once worked the fields of Texas and Kansas were gray-haired, scattered across both East and West Germany. Some had prospered, others lived quietly, but all carried with them the same improbable memory that in the land of their enemy they had been treated not with hatred, but with dignity. Time softened the details, but certain moments remained vivid. The first time they were handed pay for their labor and had laughed, thinking it was a trick, the first sip of American coffee. The laughter of guards during soccer matches, the music that drifted from the camp radio at dusk. These memories returned not as nostalgia for captivity, but as symbols of what peace could be won, ordinary kindness in the midst of extraordinary violence. In the 1980 seconds, some of them began to travel back to the United States, now as visitors. The former camps were gone, replaced by farms, factories, or open fields replaced, but they recognized the landscapes. In Louisiana, one man stood where his barracks had once been and listened to the wind, remembering the sound of a ball striking the goalpost. In Texas, a group of former prisoners and American guards met for the first time in 40 years. They spoke haltingly through translators, laughed at old misunderstandings, and shared stories of the same time seen from opposite sides of the fence. The meetings were quiet, without ceremony or politics. There were no speeches about forgiveness, no flags or anthems. There was only mutual respect, the kind that grows not from ideology, but from shared memory. Back in Germany, historians began to collect their stories. What they found surprised them. The former prisoners did not speak of suffering or anger. Instead, they described their captivity as the moment when their understanding of the world began to change. Some called it their second education. They had entered the camps as soldiers of a regime built on fear. They left as men who understood that freedom was rooted not in obedience, but in trust. Their experience became a quiet influence on post-war generations. When journalists interviewed them, they spoke modestly, often ending with the same reflection. "When we thought it was a trick. It was Wes. It was humanity." In towns across Germany, local museums began to dedicate small exhibits to their memories. Photographs of smiling young men in work clothes, American guards posing beside them, soccer balls resting in the dust. To those who did not know the context, the images looked almost ordinary, But to those who had lived it, they were reminders that even in war, decency could survive. As old age settled in, the former prisoners faced the fading of their own generation. Reunions grew smaller, letters fewer. Yet every year, around Christmas, some of them still wrote to the families of their former guards, exchanging photographs of grandchildren, harvests, or the changing seasons. The letters were simple and warm, bound by an invisible friendship that had begun in captivity. When the last of them passed away, their families sometimes found souvenirs tucked away in drawers, a faded Red Cross booklet, a wooden chess piece carved from camp scrap, or a small piece of paper currency marked Vikayan, Army Canteen Token, Vikach. These relics were not of defeat, but of discovery. In the end, their story was not about imprisonment at all. It was about how men, stripped of power and pride, could rediscover humanity when treated with fairness. They had crossed an ocean expecting punishment and found instead a lesson in peace. And as history moved forward, that lesson remained VOD, that mercy shown to an enemy does not weaken a nation, but defines its strength. For those who had once lived behind the wire, that truth outlasted the war, the borders, and even time itself. They had been prisoners once, but they had left America carrying something far more enduring than freedom, the memory of kindness,